Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a deeply complex, historically rich topic. We're going to map out the evolution of political radicalism across Europe. To do this, we'll be relying on a comprehensive institute report that takes an incredibly objective documentarian approach to understanding right-wing extremism, racism, and xenophobia. Now, my goal today absolutely isn't to take a political stance. Instead, I'm here to guide you through the raw data and the historical shifts exactly as the sources present them. We are going to look closely at how governments and societies have historically understood and, attempted to prevent the spread of these ideologies. Let's dive right in. The foundation of our analysis today actually stems from state-funded initiatives like the Promoting Tolerance, Strengthening Competence Program. Our explainer draws heavily from a pedagogical study that evaluates these exact kinds of prevention programs. It's truly fascinating to look at the actual frameworks governments use to measure societal tension. We're going to use this research to understand the mechanics of extremism, not just as a passing political talking point, but as a deeply rooted sociological phenomenon that governments have been actively trying to decode for decades. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with Europe's view on extremism, then explore the myth of the tolerant Netherlands, unpack radicalization and criminalization, look at the shift in integration policy, and finish up with post-9/11 and Pim Fortuyn. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Europe's view on extremism, a continent-wide challenge. To really wrap our heads around the localized case studies we're about to examine, we first need to look at the macro picture. Right-wing radicalism, racism, and the whole complex puzzle of integration, they aren't isolated issues. The manifestations are actually incredibly diverse across Europe. For instance, the report notes that in Italy and Spain, right-wing extremism has been heavily intertwined with economic crashes and anti-immigration sentiment. In Russia, the challenge looks different. It manifests as ethnic nationalism, marked by militant violence against non-Slavic populations. Meanwhile, countries like the UK and Germany have developed highly structured pedagogical prevention programs that focus on community cohesion. So the main takeaway here, while the underlying current of radicalism is absolutely Europe-wide, every single nation faces a completely unique iteration of it, which prompts entirely different levels of state intervention. Moving right along to Section 2, the myth of the tolerant Netherlands, post-WW2 self-image. Let's zoom into our primary micro-case study, the Netherlands. This is a brilliant historical dive because it explores the stark contrast between the nation's historical self-image as this ultimate beacon of tolerance and the reality of its underlying societal tensions. To understand Dutch society, you have to understand the Soilen system, or the pillar system. For decades, the Netherlands was essentially a country of minorities. Society was strictly, and I mean strictly, divided into these distinct pillars: Catholics, Protestants, liberals, and socialists. You lived your whole life inside your specific pillar. Your schools, your sports clubs, your newspapers, all of it. Because no single group had a democratic majority, stability was maintained through top-down consensus among the elites of these pillars. Any radicalism was quickly suppressed by internal social control. It was an incredibly structured, rigid way of avoiding conflict. But, as we know, rigid systems eventually crack. In the 1960s, this pillar system began to break down. People finally started stepping outside their traditional lanes. And while this definitely brought modernization, the source material points out that it inadvertently created a massive social vacuum. Suddenly, that strict hierarchical control was just gone. And this newly open space? Well, it allowed more radical and extremist ideologies to finally bubble up to the surface of the general population. Which brings us to Section 3, radicalization and criminalization, the 1970s and 1980s. With those societal pillars crumbling, let's look at the historical roadmap of the socio-political earthquakes that shook Dutch society. We're tracing how the government reacted to sudden spikes in violent radicalism. We've got the Moluccan youth hijackings in the 70s, the sudden rise of the right-wing Centrum Party in the 80s, massive structural shifts in integration policy in the 90s, all culminating in the explosive political upheaval and assassination of Pim Fortuyn in 2002. Let's walk through exactly how the state handled these stepping stones. So, the first major test was the radicalization of Ambonese, or Moluccan youth, in the 1970s. These were the children of former colonial soldiers brought to the Netherlands. Feeling deeply marginalized and politically betrayed, some of these youths actually turned to terrorism, including train hijackings. But here's the fascinating part that the Institute report highlights. The state initially completely refused to see this as political radicalization. Instead, the courts and the government framed it strictly as a criminal issue, a problem for the police to solve. They stripped away all the socio-political context. It wasn't until much later that the government realized, hey, we actually need a structured minority policy to address this underlying social marginalization.
Section 4. The Shift in Integration Policy, Terminology and Expectations in the 1990s.
As the 1980s saw brief but very noticeable traction for right-wing political parties like the Centrumpartei, the establishment realized their old approach just wasn't cutting it anymore. Now, to track policy changes in the 90s, you really have to track the language. The Dutch government officially adopted the term allochtoon in its policy. This defined individuals with at least one parent of foreign origin. Now, this might seem like a simple linguistic tweak, but it was actually a massive shift. It moved the societal dialogue away from terms like guest workers or cultural minorities, which kind of implied temporary stays or distinct separate groups, and it officially acknowledged a permanent structural change in the demographics of the entire country. This change in vocabulary illustrates a massive structural pivot in expectations. Think about it. In the 70s and 80s, the official policy motto was literally integration while simultaneously preserving one's own culture. But by the time we hit the 1990s, that shifted entirely to integration with obligations and personal responsibility. The burden of integration was suddenly placed squarely on the shoulders of the minority populations. The state's focus shifted away from fighting discrimination and moved heavily toward demanding civic duties. What the source report notes, very impartially, is that this specific policy shift inadvertently allowed for the mainstreaming of right-wing rhetoric. During the 1990s, concepts that were once completely exclusive to the far-right fringe, phrases specifically like integration problems, asylum abuse, and debates about the incompatibility of cultures, they were increasingly absorbed into established mainstream political discourse. The lines between the political center and the fringe, they began to blur heavily. Which brings us to a crucial question, one that highlights why understanding the specific history matters so much for us today. How does a nation, one that literally built its modern identity on a pillar system explicitly designed to suppress extremism and maintain consensus, suddenly shift to seeing highly polarized discourse just casually enter the established political mainstream? Let's find out in Section 5, Post 9/11 and Pim Fortuyn, a polarized new century. The answer to that sudden polarization lies right at the turn of the millennium. It was shaped by global events and one incredibly charismatic, polarizing politician. Listen to the documented words of Pim Fortuyn from a book he published back in 1997. He wrote, "The Islamization of our culture threatens to completely destroy our original culture." Now, notice the date there, 1997. This was years before the 9/11 attacks heightened global Islamophobia. Fortuyn was actively challenging the establishment's consensus model very early on, aggressively arguing that the political elites were completely ignoring the realities of integration. A core target of Fortuyn's critique was this concept of cultural relativism, the principle that all cultures are equally valid. Fortuyn argued this was fundamentally flawed. He blamed cultural relativism for the country's failure to demand adherence to European democratic norms, women's rights, and freedom of speech from incoming immigrants. He cleverly framed this not as traditional racism, but as a defense of liberal Western values against what he saw as an intolerant religion. In this framing, it resonated deeply with a massive segment of the Dutch voting public. All of this tension built into an explosive upheaval in 2002. First, in March of that year, Fortuyn's newly founded party, the LPF, wins a massive, stunning victory in the Rotterdam local elections. He was actually poised to potentially become the prime minister. But then, on May 6th, the unthinkable happens. Fortuyn is assassinated. And in a really surprising twist to the incredibly heightened anti-migrant discourse of that moment, the objective fact is that the assassin was actually a native Dutch animal rights activist, not an immigrant at all. Despite his death, just days later, his party becomes the second strongest national party in parliament. The traditional political establishment was completely shattered. The direct aftermath of this era was profound. The report details how the state rapidly institutionalized anti-terrorism security. They appointed a national coordinator for counterterrorism in 2004 following further attacks abroad. But more than just security, the political climate became permanently polarized. That old consensus model of the pillar system, it was definitively dead, replaced by an atmosphere of heightened inter-ethnic tension, strict security measures, and a continuous, intense debate over what the national identity actually was. As we've seen today, taking this journey from the macro-European view all the way down to the micro-Dutch case study, radicalism isn't just a policing issue, right? It's a deeply systemic societal one. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Can a modern society effectively prevent political radicalism without fully addressing its own deep-rooted structural inequalities and shifting national identity? The data we've looked at suggests that security alone just isn't enough. The very structural foundations of society itself have to be part of the equation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.